Hello, it's Sebastian Stodolak, and this is Through Bastiat's Eye. This pandemic would be much worse without internet. It saved not only millions of jobs, but also art by providing artists with platform to share their creation while they cannot, for example, perform live. Professor Joel Waldfogel, an economist from University of Minnesota, is going even further in terms of appreciation of this digital era and internet. In his book, Digital Renaissance, he proves that digital revolution actually is a growth engine of supply of artistic production. Hello, Professor, how are you?
Fine, thank you.
Many artists, especially musicians, before pandemic claimed that internet is killing them because it makes it hard to profit from creating art. Will they change their minds now when they see how how big a blessing could internet be in terms of in times of pandemic?
Well, I think they'll still look at this pandemic era as a very bad era because, I mean, many musical artists, for example, rely on live performance for a lot of their income, and they really can't do that. They can provide limited shows live on the internet. Like that's small compared to, so it's better than it would have been if we just had a pandemic and no internet. But I don't think they'll look at the pandemic as a happy period, even though in many ways there are a lot of things about digitization that has allowed both consumers and artists to really benefit relative to what they would have experienced during the internet, but not relative to a non-pandemic.
So, well, this is interesting. So the limitation of internet are also more visible in times of pandemic, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, the internet is wonderful. A pandemic without an internet would be even worse. But even a pandemic with internet is still worse than no pandemic for most artists. Again, many artists, musical artists, make a lot of money from live performance, and that's been essentially shut down during the pandemic.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's go back in the past before it all started. So to the period that you referred in your book that I mentioned before, you show a lot of statistics saying that actually the artistic production has been growing during the last decades, partly due to this digital era, digital, creative distraction, right?
Yes, I mean, so if we can go back a little bit and think about the ambivalent relationship that I think a lot of artists have had with digitization. If we go back 20 years, then in music, digitization arrives as Napster. That is the ability of people to pirate, to take things without paying for it. And so at that time, digitization and the internet is just a threat, really. There's nothing good about it. It just undermines the ability of artists to make money selling the things the way they traditionally had. But it didn't take very long for the internet to also reveal some other sides. So in addition to making it possible for people to steal, it also made it much cheaper to produce and to distribute and even to promote new art in music, in film, in television, in books. And so what happened was really nothing short of an explosion in creative output. That is, the number of new works, creative works in each of these categories really just exploded. Went up by factors of 3, 5, 10, depending on the category. Now, of course, a lot of it isn't important. It's not valuable to very many people. But what's really interesting is that with creative products, it's very hard to predict which ones will be popular. So anything that causes us to create a lot more, well, it's going to deliver a lot that aren't popular, but a few that turn out to be very popular. And that's exactly what's happened here. We have lots of examples of music and books and movies that really wouldn't have come into existence before, but that are now quite popular.
So without internet, we would have fewer books, movies, music.
Yes,
songs.
Absolutely. I mean, we can think about sort of the specifics because the internet is a very broad term, but if you think about, say movies for a second, traditionally, one made movies in order to exhibit them in theaters. Now, in order for a movie to be worth exhibiting in theaters, it really has to be a pretty attractive kind of a movie, the sort of movie that would be appealing to a lot of people, even in a particular geographic locale. But once you're distributing online instead of in theaters, what you need is a bunch of people somewhere on the planet who like the product. You don't need a bunch of people physically near each of a bunch of theaters. And so that means that the threshold for making something that might be, economically viable because it can generate revenue really changes drastically. So that's one kind of example. I mean, in music, it used to be the case we really had to get onto the radio. Now, even the songs that got onto the radio, and only a very limited number of new songs could get on the radio, even those that got on the radio, many of them, most of them didn't succeed. But now, instead of that limitation of having to get on the radio, well, you need to get onto a streaming platform. Now, there are some other bottlenecks and challenges, but still, there's essentially no obstacle to almost any artist making his or her wares available to many people. Now, again, I don't want to sound naive. There are huge issues still about which things get promoted and which become popular. But there isn't an initial gatekeeping decision that simply prevents most potential creators from creating.
There's this famous quote from Robert Solow about productivity of computers, that you can see the computer age everywhere, but in the productivity statistics. And for some time, the same observation was often voiced in terms of the effect of internet on productivity. But here in the area of art production, actually the productivity increase due to internet is quite visible, right?
I think so. Now, so I'm an economist. I'm not an aesthete. So for me, I talk about products and their value having to do with the usual way economists think about value. Do a lot of people are a lot of people willing to pay for it? Does it generate revenue? And then something called consumer surplus for consumers, which is not the same as, say, the way serious art critics would talk about art. That said, there is quite a lot of even critically acclaimed material being produced in this era. So even though the gatekeepers can no longer prevent what aesthetic experts might regard as garbage from coming to market, there are also a lot of things coming to market that they would have stopped, but then turn out to be even artistically appealing, or at least moderately artistically appealing.
So we are not observing a decline in the quality of art. This is not the case.
No, I mean, so it sort of depends how you count. So if you were to say a randomly selected, now here I don't want to sound like a snob, but if you were to take a randomly selected song from the 5 million new songs produced last year, it would probably be terrible in the eyes of both most consumers and most critics. But if you were to ask the question, how good were the 1,000 best songs produced in a year when 5 million were created versus the 1,000 best songs created in a year when, say, 1/10 as many songs were created? Well, I would argue to you, with evidence, that in the year when 5 million were created, the best songs were better, because we create more. We don't know whether it's going to be good. We take a lot of draws, and it turns out we get a bunch of winners. We get a bunch of losers too. So there is a sense in which there's a wonderful quote from Cory Doctorow talking about a self-publishing platform. He talks about it as an open slush pile. There's a sense in which we're wading through an open slush pile. But what really matters is the best stuff, not the average stuff.
I recently read a book by Alan Kruger, Rockonomics. By the way, you are quoted in this book. There is this observation that even though internet offers such a great platform to share your creation with others, it doesn't eliminate this winner takes it all effect. Is that correct?
Well, I mean, I think what's interesting in this digital era, so on the one hand, it's become very easy for almost anyone to create a product. And so there's a huge growth in the number of products. And there are a lot of products, because one doesn't really need as much revenue to be viable. There are a lot of products that are viable. Now, at the same time, though, Hollywood is still spending lots of money on the biggest kinds of movies, the movies they intend to be biggest, and those still are attracting an enormous amount of attention. The same is true in music. I mean, look how much streaming Drake gets. So we really have both things happening at once. On the one hand, we have this kind of blockbusterization at the right tail of distribution, but we have an enormous amount of variety, an enormous number of products all over the distribution, and lots of different niches can exist profitably because costs are so much lower.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the problems that in the first phase internet created for artists because of the piracy, for example. It hijacked the revenue from selling albums. Now albums are the least source of revenue. Live shows in music, for example, is the main source of the revenue. But in terms of internet, there are still a lot of artists complaining that they don't get their fair share. Yeah, even those big artists like, say, Paul McCartney, right? So Paul McCartney even was saying that, this internet is not fair. We need to, introduce some fair regulations in order to compensate artists for the profits streaming services are making out of them. What do you think of those kind of complaints or opinions?
Well, so I'm going to be an economist here and have an answer with the one hand and another hand. I mean, on the one hand, the way that revenue is generated for recorded music now is really largely through streaming. So Spotify, Apple Music, Deezer, platforms like that. Now, what's interesting about that is that revenue is generated when people listen. In the old days, revenue was generated when you purchased a song or an album. You could listen to it for the rest of your life and no more revenue was ever generated. I mean, there was revenue generated from other sources, but from the sale of music, it was just at the time you bought it. Now, what's interesting about that is that we listen to a lot of old music. So a lot of old music is generating more revenue now than it used to generate. So in some sense, when an artist who used to be popular, now Paul McCartney is still popular, so let's not criticize him in any sense, but some artists who used to be popular and that they were listened to by people taking their old vinyl or CDs out of dusty boxes and listening to them, that didn't generate any revenue. Now it does. So there are a lot of artists who get small checks who wish they would get large checks, but in the old days, they would have gotten no checks. So, I mean, that's one hand. On the other hand, the streaming services are very powerful. There are essentially two major ones in this part of the world, but a few more in the rest. They have a lot of power to determine what succeeds and whatever they essentially negotiate with the record labels, they'll pay them. That's going to determine both what the labels get, and then the labels have to share that with the artists. So there's I'm sure lots to complain about, and it's a complicated system, but there are many artists who in the current system are getting things that they would have gotten nothing in the old system. And one example again is what I just said. So old artists who weren't selling any new CDs. The other though is artists who used to not get released at all. So there were 5 million new songs loaded into Spotify a couple of years ago. They weren't all new, but some number like 5, that's an enormous number. Therefore, an enormous number of artists who are producing music. Many of those artists would have had no way to distribute their music prior to the digital era. And so they're getting something instead of getting essentially nothing. Now, again, many of them are getting very little. So I understand why they're not happy, but part of why they're getting very little, well, part of it is they're sharing it with labels, and part of it is that they're competing with so many other people. When you allow a lot of entities to enter a market, it's quite competitive.
When you compare music market, for example, or art market in general, the part of the market that got transformed into the digital world, and you compare it with, say, traditional taxi industry that faced creative distractions due to Uber-like apps, which industry was hit in a more painful way? Taxi drivers or the old artists?
Well, I think in the case of taxi drivers in many cities around the world, and a few cities in the US, one had to buy a license, a taxi medallion. And these licenses were very expensive, and they were predicated on the idea that there would be no competition. And so a person who bought a license like that and then faced entry from Uber, that person really lost a lot. And my heart goes out to the taxi drivers in New York, especially those who were defrauded in their purchases of medallions. So in that sense, those are some real, economic losers. Whereas I think in music or in other creative arts, there are two kinds of losers. So initially, there was stealing, and stealing was depriving revenue. I mean, it was doing a lot of things, because some of the stealing was stuff that wouldn't otherwise have been purchased, but some of the stealing was stuff that would have been purchased. So it was depriving labels and artists and that's in music, it was depriving studios, it was depriving publishers of revenue. But that's not so much the problem anymore. It is a problem in parts of the world. Now the big challenge is that there are just, you know, so many artists, so much material. And so I think facing competition from so many other artists is a challenge. I think artists would say, I don't get paid enough per stream. And that may or may not be right. I'm not sure they're wrong, but I'm not sure they're right either, because in many cases they're being paid, again, as I say, in instances when they otherwise wouldn't have been paid at all.
Okay, so if you hear somebody saying we need to put some regulations in place in order to make internet fairer place for artists, for example, a place where they got compensated enough according to their expectations. What would you respond to such people claiming that we are in need for such regulations? Maybe we are.
Well, I would say two things. One is we don't need regulation to protect us from competition. But I think what we might need is regulation to protect us from, say, for example, powerful platforms. It's conceivable, and I've studied Spotify a lot just as an example, and I actually don't see them doing a lot of bad things. I mean, but that said, just textbook economics, if we only have a few entities that are engaged in essentially purchasing the rights to stream music, one could imagine market power being exercised on the buyer side. So we should be vigilant about that. It's not inconceivable that there's a problem. But I think to the extent that the problem is competition, that's not really a problem. And so when I do hear artists often say, compensation is too low, you know, people are going to stop producing, and that'll be a tragedy for consumers. And I agree with that in principle. But if you look at the statistics, no one has stopped. I mean, I shouldn't say no one has stopped producing, but production has really increased very, very substantially in the past 15 years. Mm-hmm. And so there is no danger, there's no apparent danger of supply stopping. Usually, you know, we would say we need policy because the market's failing and it's not producing anything. That doesn't seem to be what's happening here. So I mean, I'm sympathetic. And after all, I'm a professor, and we are going to face in our industry all kinds of challenges from online education and so forth. And so I understand how threatening technological change is and competition from various kinds of entities that used to be remote from one. But I'm not sure that competition is really the problem here. Concentration, on the other hand, might be the problem.
Mm-hmm. So when you look at the internet or digital technologies, like from the view of, how should I spell it in English? When you take this general view like a bird view is something like
bird's eye, aerial view.
Yeah. So if you take a bird's eye view on the internet and digital technologies, you can see this great variety of everything and almost constant creation or recreation, reconfiguring of contents. What is the source of all this? Is there anything special about internet and digital technologies that allows for this variety, creativity?
So I think in a generic sense, the important idea is that the costs of trying new things, the costs have fallen. And so more people can try new things. But that takes, different specific forms in industries, and it's worth talking about them because they're interesting. I think it makes it all very plausible. In books, it used to be to get a book published, you had to get an agent and then get that agent to convince a publisher to publish that book. And publishing a book was a big deal because if you're going to bother publishing it, you're also going to try to get it into bookstores. And bookstores really don't have that much space. So there are a whole bunch of obstacles. Many would-be authors are just said, no, thank you, we're not going to publish your book. And so many books don't see the light of day. Now remember, books, like all creative products, are very hard to predict. So even most of the books chosen by the curators, the old-time curators, fail. Now what's happened now is that if I have an idea for a book, I can go to a publisher or I can self-publish. For example, one of the big self-publishing programs is Kindle Direct through Amazon. So I can essentially write a book, render it as PDF, upload it, charge $5 for it. I keep 70%, they keep 30%. Now, that's no guarantee, but the book will be good. It may not be proofread, it may not be copy edited and all the rest. But what's so interesting is that many, many, many books have begun life as self-published books. And then as they sell, and it becomes evident that they're selling, then a traditional publisher will purchase the rights to that book, clean it up, and republish it. Now, that is, in all likelihood, a book that they said no to or wouldn't have said yes to before, but because of digitization, there's a low-cost way to try and find out if it has an audience, and once we find out that it does, then we can make it available to people. And again, it's a product that wouldn't have been discovered without the internet. So that's an example, like how is it that the internet makes it possible, or digitization in books? It just really reduces the cost. You know, in music, and I'll stop as soon as you want me to, but in music, I used to need an expensive recording studio and really skilled labor to even make a recording. And then if I were so lucky, you know, if I could do that, I could maybe sell it out of the trunk of my car at my concerts, but that's not very effective. I might be able to beg my way onto a college radio station, but to get it onto, you know, major radio stations, I needed the support of a record label, and they had to pay money. I mean, payola is illegal, but there were still costs associated with getting music on the radio. So very few songs got to even try. Now, again, you know, I can record a song using GarageBand on my Mac or an iPhone. I can upload it to Spotify pretty, you know, almost at no cost to myself. And now it's a product. Now, whether anybody finds it or listens to it is another challenge, but it's just so much easier to take a chance to try. And the same is true in the other industries as well. So digitization reduced costs and made it easier for more people to try.
So we could say that maybe internet democratized the art production, and the technologies democratized them.
I think you absolutely could say that. You know, it is interesting. Sometimes I'll talk to people, or usually I guess maybe more accurately be berated by people in the traditional industries who say this democratization is terrible because, you know, it takes real skill to make these products. It takes both the skill of the artist and the curation of the gatekeepers. And of course, there's some truth to that. A lot of amazing stories of curation and gatekeeping and so forth. But I think what's also true is that there's an enormous amount of art now that's very successful that started life outside of any of those traditional systems. So I take with a grain of salt the claims by the traditional players that technological change is bad because it harms them.